WisconsinEye's Campaign 2024 programming is sponsored by Wisconsin Counties Association, Nicolet National Bank, Wisconsin Hospital Association, Operating Engineers Local 139, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, the Wisconsin Laborers District Council, and North Central State's Regional Council of Carpenters. To support programs like this, please consider a tax-deductible donation at wiseye.org/donate or by texting WisEye to 44321.
U.S. Representative Bryan Steil of Janesville is the Republican incumbent candidate for the 1st Congressional District. The election is November 5th. Congressman Steil, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me on.
Can you tell us why you're running for re-election and what's the key message of your campaign?
There's a lot of work to be done to get our country back on track. A lot of people are suffering from the economy right now. Prices are too high. Everything is roughly 20% more expensive than it was when the Biden-Harris administration began 4 years ago. We also have to secure the U.S.-Mexico border, and the impact of the border is being felt here in the state of Wisconsin. So to me, this election comes down to two key issues. How do we lower costs so families can afford the things that they need? And how do we work to secure the U.S.-Mexico border?
So what do you see as the most pressing issue before the country, and what's a specific action you would take if you're reelected?
So many families can't afford what they need, and it's brought to us by the reckless inflation of the Biden-Harris administration, really driven by the reckless spending in the first 2 years under Democratic one-party control. How do we get inflation down and bring costs down? I think you need to do three key things. One, you have to address the reckless spending in Washington that drove the inflation in the first place. But we have to do more than just that. Two, we have to address the regulatory burden being driven out of Washington that is punishing a lot of our employers, ultimately those costs being borne by consumers across our state. And then third, we need a national energy approach, and all of the above approach that lowers the cost of energy, which is impacting not only the cost to fill up your car with gas, for example, but also impacts your grocery bill. Because as we know, it's not only the corn that's in your cornflakes, it's the diesel tractor that was in the fields. It was the truck that brought it to the grocery store. And for cold dairy products, we know it's the chiller, which is ultimately using electricity to keep your milk or your yogurt cold. And so if we have an energy policy that allows us to bring prices down, if we address the regulatory burden that is coming out of Washington, and we address the reckless spending, we can lower inflation and make things more affordable for Wisconsin families.
So is there an example of a specific regulation you would pull back or a specific area of spending that you would seek to reduce immediately?
Well, I think there's a host of areas, but I'll give you one core example that I think exemplifies the problem of Washington. Is in the first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration, rules and regulations were put in place as it relates to electric vehicles. Whether or not you think electric vehicles is the future or not, my view is your federal government should not subsidize the purchase of someone who wants to buy a brand new Tesla, but we also shouldn't have the government in the business of deciding where electrical vehicle charging stations are or to pay for it. If we reflect back maybe about 100 years ago, we were trying to remove the problem of horse manure in our nation's largest cities, and somebody came up with the internal combustion engine. We leveraged the American free market to move forward. It was not the federal government deciding where gas stations should be built. It was the local free market. Same with whether or not you wanted to buy a Model T. We need to embrace the American capitalist system to address what vehicles people want to drive. We shouldn't have a heavy-handed approach. And when we see the cost of not only new vehicles going up, it's more expensive to insure your car, it's more expensive to refuel your car. This is all being driven by bad policies in Washington. And instead, we should get the federal government out of the way and allow consumers to make the decisions that are best for them.
What's an example of a piece of legislation or policy you would propose that would incentivize economic growth specifically in Wisconsin?
Well, we are going to have a big conversation about what we want to do with the taxes that are the tax cuts that are expiring on the backside of this election, and making sure that the taxes don't go up on hardworking families is a really important piece of that. When we think about the pro-growth policies, we can look at kind of in the weeds topics like accelerated depreciation or the R&D tax credit. These are programs that are absolutely essential to American, in particular, Wisconsin manufacturing companies, that we're incentivizing those employers to invest here in the state of Wisconsin, here in the United States of America, rather than having tax policies that encourage them to make and produce their product overseas. The more we're encouraging employers to be investing here in the U.S., the better off we are. And as we see the potential rise in taxes on the backside of this election, allowing those tax rates to increase will disincentivize investment here in the United States, and it'll hurt American workers who would see their tax bills go up as well.
You've been talking about inflation. We know inflation has stabilized, but it's still above pre-pandemic rates. What, if any, is the role of Congress in keeping the cost of goods and services low?
We need to make sure that we have policies that don't drive inflation higher. And so while the rate of inflation has come down, the cumulative impact of that is still felt. And consumers feel the cumulative impact of inflation more than they feel the rate on any given day. I use the example, I was at the airport and a young woman's toddler started running away from her and then started walking away from her. That's a little bit of what inflation is. It ran away from us and now it's walking away from us. It doesn't do you a whole heck of a lot of good when everything's still 20% more expensive than when it was before. What we have to do is help wages catch up with that in real terms. And if we remember before the pandemic, after the Trump tax reforms, what we saw was real wages rising, in particular, much faster than inflation, meaning in real terms. And that was true for all key demographic groups. So that was true for women, for veterans, for Asians, for Hispanics, for Blacks, and even more so for those groups than others because they had the biggest room for growth. That's really good news. Then what we saw on the backside of the pandemic was inflationary policies and real wages were falling. So your dollar that you earned didn't go as far to the extent of 20% over the course of 4 years. So if we have good, strong pro-growth policies, American workers will see their real wages rise so they can afford more with what they're earning.
Do you support an increase in the federal minimum wage?
I think we need to be focused in on raising all wages. And so we do that through core economic growth policies. Here in Rock County and around our state, many of the starting wages are well above the minimum wage. That's a good thing. What we want to do is encourage employers to come to Southeast Wisconsin to hire the best workforce in the entire globe is here in the state of Wisconsin. And we do that by putting forward pro-growth policies. When you put in price floors and price controls out of Washington, sometimes what we actually have seen is that lowers the actual worker wage. What we want is competition for workers in the state of Wisconsin. Through those natural forces, we can sustain higher wages. We've seen progress since the Great Recession, but we do have room for growth, and we can continue to see all wages rising if we put in place those pro-growth policies and we steer away from the inflationary policies of the Biden-Harris administration.
As you know, it's become increasingly expensive to raise a family. What policies do you support that would make raising a family more affordable? For instance, do you support expanding the child tax credit or expanding childcare subsidies?
So many families can't afford what they need, in particular families with young children, everything from paying the grocery bill to paying for childcare. Let's dive into childcare because I think this is a topic that needs more of a conversation in our state and in our country. What we saw the Biden-Harris administration do was put regulatory red tape in our childcare sector. What that did was limit the number of individuals who could provide childcare and made it less accessible and less affordable for a number of families. What we should be working on is increasing the number of individuals who can provide that childcare and embracing, in particular, faith-based providers. The Biden-Harris administration made it very difficult for faith-based providers to be able to participate in the federal program. That is really difficult, in particular, in some of our state's largest cities where faith-based providers are located near those hardworking families that need that service. We see this play out, for example, in Racine, where a number of churches were providing faith-based childcare directly to workers, young families in their neighborhoods. The Biden-Harris administration policies made it much more difficult for those churches to be able to provide that service. We saw the Biden-Harris administration also put forward regulations that required, for example, in some cases, a 4-year college degree to be able to provide childcare. That's an unnecessary regulation and limited the number of people who could step up and fill that absolutely essential need. What we need to do instead is encourage more people to enter into the childcare providing service. And we can do that by removing unnecessary red tape and truly embracing faith-based providers, which will play an essential role in our state's larger cities.
The cost of housing is also another issue affecting Wisconsinites. Is there any federal policy or legislation you would support that would lower the cost of housing needs, either for renters or home buyers?
The median mortgage in the nation is reflective in the state of Wisconsin has nearly doubled over the course of the last 4 years, from $1,200 to $2,400 for the same home, making it so difficult for families to go from paying the rent to paying the mortgage. We need to address this, I think, in 2 key ways. One, we need to increase the total number of housing units in the United States. That is often local and state level regulations that get in the way, that throttle our ability in Wisconsin to increase our housing supply. That's often at the local level, although at the federal level, I support legislation that would try to reduce that burden. At the federal level, the number one thing we can do is get inflation under control. As interest rates rose, it made it more and more expensive for your monthly mortgage to your monthly mortgage increased as payments for a payment on your house. So if we work to bring the interest rate down, it'll make housing more affordable for a lot of families. The Federal Reserve is simply reacting to bad federal policy that drove inflation higher. And so if we go back and we focus in on bringing inflation down, the Federal Reserve will be able to reduce the interest rate, and the real world impact of that will monthly mortgage payments will come down, making housing more affordable. So if we focus in on the increasing the total supply of housing, and at the same time we work to make sure that we're reducing inflation, we can make housing more available and more affordable.
Social Security, as you know, faces potential long-term financing shortfalls. What reforms to Social Security do you support to ensure future solvency?
Social Security is an absolutely essential program that we have to protect for our seniors. It's a program our seniors have paid into, our seniors have earned, and our seniors deserve to know is going to be there. When we see the massive reckless spending that's come out of Washington, in many ways, that jeopardizes our most essential programs, including Social Security. I'd also add in Medicare and veterans benefits that are at risk from massive new government spending that we saw, in particular during the first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration. As we work to address the reckless spending in other areas, that gives us an opportunity to make sure that we're protecting Social Security for our seniors. And again, the more we have pro-growth policies, encouraging people to enter into the workforce, to come off the sidelines and join the workforce here in the United States, that raises more revenue without increasing the tax rate. That's an essential piece of the puzzle as we work to shore up Social Security.
Do you support changing the retirement age for Social Security?
I would oppose changing the retirement age, in particular for those seniors in retirement and those approaching retirement age. Again, the focus should be on other reckless spending and encouraging workers to come into the workforce. And as those workers come in, that will naturally work to shore up the program.
Medical systems are facing numerous headwinds in the form of inflation, workforce development, and issues around Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement, resulting in fewer services and even the closure of a hospital system in Western Wisconsin. What would you do to preserve access to care and prevent future closures of that type?
Healthcare in our state has been challenging. It's expensive. It's becoming less accessible, as you just noted, with the closure of certain facilities. What we need to make sure we're doing is lowering the cost of healthcare in our state and improving efficiencies in that space. The second is on the workforce development side. So much of our educational product has an opportunity to be more closely tied to our true workforce needs. None of this could be more apparent than in the healthcare space, where young men and women coming out of high school, we need to make sure that they're gaining the skills that they need to be the next technician, the next registered nurse, and the next doctor in our state. As we're increasing the supply of our healthcare workers, that will assist us both in the long-term care crisis that we have, as well as in the more traditional medical needs in our state.
Local communities in Wisconsin are faced with a growing number of issues. For example, issues related to water quality and PFAS contamination, or a sudden influx of refugees like Wisconsin saw in 2021. How do you plan to collaborate with local governments, or what are examples of how you have collaborated with local governments to make sure they have the resources necessary to address those types of issues?
I work hard in Southeast Wisconsin, crisscrossing the district, talking to local officials about their needs, and work as a liaison in many ways to help those local officials obtain federal grant funding. We've been successful in some cases assisting those municipalities. At the end of the Trump administration, we saw a significant grant be given to the Racine-Kenosha area to replace lead lateral pipes. Other areas where we've seen challenges, as you noted, is the flow of migrants into communities, in particular in the city of Whitewater, a city of 15,000 people that the chief of police has noted has roughly 1,000 migrants, primarily from Nicaragua and Venezuela. On that side, that's where the federal government needs to come in and actually secure the U.S.-Mexico border and make sure that those resources that are available to address this challenge aren't just provided to our nation's largest cities like Washington, D.C., New York, or Chicago, but that those funds are also available to our smaller communities such as Whitewater. And again, I work as a liaison with a number of our local jurisdictions to make sure that we are assisting them while they apply for those federal grants. Philosophically, I'm of the view that decisions are best made locally, but while those federal grant programs are available, I stand ready, willing, and continually assist our local jurisdictions in obtaining those federal funds.
We've talked a little bit about taxes already, but I want to make sure I ask you, you are in support of making permanent the Trump tax cuts from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017?
The tax reforms that were put in place before the pandemic led to the great economic growth that we saw heading into the pandemic. Real wages were rising. We were seeing employers expanding here in the state of Wisconsin and across our country. And I think it would be foolish to raise taxes on employers and raise taxes on hardworking families at a period of time when so many are struggling to make ends meet.
Some estimates put that cost of those tax cuts at $3.8 trillion added to the deficit over the next decade. Is that accurate information, or how would you plan to address that?
I think we should look back at the empirical data following the tax reforms when they were put in place. What we actually saw was tax revenue increase due to the economic growth that it generated. And so what we sometimes fail to see through some of these reports, I want to dig into the numbers you're providing me, but what often is noted is the economic impact is only looked as a reduction in revenue, where the empirical data often shows us that if you make smart pro-growth tax reforms, what you actually will do is grow the economy at such a rate that total tax revenue increases. And if we look at the empirical data, what actually happened following the Trump tax reforms is that total revenue increased in the United States at a period of time where real wages were increasing. That's what we want. We want that economic growth, and we want individuals to be able to afford more with their hard-earned dollars.
You're not concerned that those tax cuts add to the deficit?
Well, I think what we saw was empirically actually the opposite. We saw economic growth in total tax revenue from the federal government increase during that period of time.
Should there be a federal abortion policy passed by Congress, or should the issue be left solely to the states?
This is an issue not well settled in 30-second negative TV ads. It should be noted in the state of Wisconsin, under current law, abortion is available till 20 weeks through a pregnancy, halfway through a woman's pregnancy. I myself have reasonable exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I think President Trump has made clear, Speaker Johnson has made clear, and I would agree with them, that we should not move forward with a federal ban. Again, the decision is best made at the local level following the Dobbs decision.
What is your position on climate change, and what congressional actions do you support that balance environmental and economic concerns with economic growth and job creation?
We love to live in the state of Wisconsin, if you're like me, because you love to be outside. That includes in the summer as well as the winter when we get our snow. We need to have clean air and clean water. We need to make sure we're protecting our air, water, and environment while not stifling economic growth. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. One of the areas I think all of us should be able to come together on is the speed at which we complete our environmental reviews. This has been a huge challenge for employers who want to invest here in the United States of America. For example, if you want to build a chips manufacturing plant in the U.S., it takes about 7 years. If you want to do it in Taiwan, it takes 18 months or less. And so we don't need to reduce our environmental standards. What we should do is accelerate the review process. And that's where I think we have a real opportunity to bring Democrats and Republicans together to maintain our environmental standards, but increase the speed at which we conduct a lot of our environmental reviews.
Should the United States continue to provide military support to Ukraine, and for how long and in what form?
Tyrants, when they sense weakness, is when they choose to act. And so following the botched evacuation of Afghanistan, we saw a number of tyrants around the globe choose to make moves because they sense the U.S. is negotiating from a position of weakness. We saw Iran and their proxies attack our ally Israel, both through Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as directly. We've seen communist China make moves against Taiwan. We've seen actions in South Sudan and in the Congo, as well as you noted, Russia's unjust invasion of Ukraine. I think there's an appropriateness to make sure that we are providing U.S. produced and developed weapons to destroy Russian assets as it relates to this unjust invasion. That said, I think we have an absolute need to make sure we're providing the American people with additional transparency as it relates to the transfer of any weapons to Ukraine, as well as to make sure that we're not transferring funds unrelated to the direct purpose of stopping that invasion. So in the previous bill that went through Congress, for example, there was $300 million or so related to narcotics trafficking. An important conversation to discuss narcotics trafficking, but that shouldn't be included in a transfer of weapons. The other piece here is we need to force our allies, in particular our NATO allies, to cover their fair share. Following the end of the Cold War, our NATO allies, their spending on defense fell well below their treaty obligations. And I think it's absolutely imperative that our European partners step up to the plate because this is ultimately their backyard.
How should the U.S. be balancing support for Israel with concerns over civilian casualties in Gaza?
Israel, as previously noted, was attacked by Iran's proxies, in this case, the terrorist group Hamas. They have a right to defend themselves. I think it's important that we stand strongly with Israel, our strongest ally in the Middle East, as they defend themselves. This war could end tomorrow if Hamas chose to end it by releasing the hostages and disarming and surrendering. And so the answer here, for the sake of everyone, is to stand with Israel so that they can ultimately defeat Hamas and release the hostages. And again, Hamas could end this war tomorrow by releasing the hostages and disarming. They continue to drag this out to the detriment of a lot of people in the Middle East.
What about the civilian casualties? Is there any conditions that the United States should have on Israel related to that?
Israel should be able to conduct their operations to ultimately defeat the terrorist group of Hamas. Again, Hamas has the ability to protect all of these individuals if they release the hostages that they took on that horrible day, October 7th, and they should disarm. Hamas is no friend to the people of Palestine, and this war could end tomorrow if Hamas made that decision.
I have two campaign-related questions for you. Are you troubled by the record-breaking amounts of out-of-state money being solicited by Wisconsin campaign operatives to influence our elections?
I not only am I frustrated, I think everybody's frustrated with the amount of money that is spent in these elections. And that's where programs like yours are so essential, that viewers can go and listen to candidates in a long-form interview about the policies that are facing this country. Unfortunately, too few viewers will ultimately choose to listen to this product versus listen to a 30-second negative TV ad in the middle of the Packers game. And so frustrating. I share the frustration of the massive amount of out-of-state money that comes into this state during an election season. And I would far more prefer more and more people engage in long-form interviews and discussions about such essential topics.
Do you support campaign finance reform legislation?
I not only do I support it, I've introduced a series of bills related to this. One is my concern about foreign money coming into U.S. elections. We have proven a loophole that has been used that has allowed foreign billionaires to transfer monies into 501c4 organizations that then siphon portions of that off to run super PAC ads. I share the frustration. I'm working to close those loopholes and provide the American people with additional transparency as it relates to money in politics.
You mentioned the infiltration of negative ads. There are so many ads in this election year that run that fine line between accuracy and exaggeration. What would you say to a voter who might ask you to stop running any negative ads?
I'd share their frustration. My opponent has been running intentionally misleading ads for the duration of his campaign. Some ads that have been called blatantly false. Again, I would love for people to engage in long form conversations and interviews on the topics. I think we would all be far better served if more and more people participated in long form discussions about the policies that we're facing rather than rely on 30-second TV ads.
We need to promote WisconsinEye interviews. The number of Wisconsin school districts going to referendum asking local taxpayers for funding is increasing. Is there any need to increase federal funding for K-12 education?
Federal funding often comes with regulatory red tape. And so my concern is that we would see an increase in federal control over local education. I want to have the funding be locally sourced so that there is local control in our education. Ultimately, voters will have a say in many jurisdictions, including in my home school district here. And so voters will ultimately go to the polls and make that decision on a case-by-case basis. The more we're allowing and encouraging local control in our education, the better served we are. I think we're often poorly served when Washington, D.C. Comes in and sets forward rules and regulations, in particular, as it relates to our children's education.
Do you support federal student loan forgiveness?
The student loan giveaway of the Biden-Harris administration is political, it's unfair, it's inflationary, and doesn't solve the underlying problem. What we should be focused in on is correctly would be the actual high cost of higher education in the first place. I served on the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents prior to running for office. I worked on this issue firsthand. While I was on the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents, we held in-state undergraduate tuition flat. That should be the focus, is on lowering the ultimate cost of our higher educational product while maintaining a high quality education, in particular one that's directly tied to our true workforce needs. Simply throwing money at the problem after the fact, I think is incredibly frustrating because it's unfair. It's inflationary. I think it's unconstitutional what the president has done unilaterally. But at its core, it does nothing to solve the underlying problem.
What would you do to focus on an effort to fix what many call a very, very broken immigration system?
First and foremost, we need to secure the U.S.-Mexico border. President Biden, if he so chose, could do four key things that would dramatically improve the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border. He could end abuse of the parole system. He could stop, catch, and release. He could reinstate stay in Mexico, and he could restart border wall construction immediately. The president has chosen not to do that, and we have seen the consequences of failure to secure the U.S.-Mexico border. If we secure the U.S.-Mexico border, we have an opportunity to address what is a broken legal immigration system. And in particular, we should be really looking at our true workforce needs here in the United States as it relates to allowing individuals to legally immigrate to the United States. But first and foremost, we have to secure the U.S.-Mexico border. We have the tools to do that. In this election will determine whether or not we're able to move forward with true border security.
What's your position on former President Trump's policy around mass deportation? Do you think that would have a negative impact on Wisconsin?
I think the real focus is on making sure we remove individuals that are not only convicted crimes, but the individuals that convicted crimes and are found guilty of it. This is where my opponent and I would have a firm disagreement. When he was in Madison, he allowed sanctuary cities to operate in Wisconsin. For example, Dane County does not cooperate with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's allowed under state law, and my opponent voted to make sure that that was allowed. I think we should be enforcing our immigration laws that are on the books. Individuals that commit, in particular, violent crimes should be deported if they're here illegally. That should be the focus of our work as it relates to the need to keep our communities safe.
We're down to our final two questions. I'll ask you, what's the biggest difference between you and your opponent?
We have just strong disagreements on policy, and that's a healthy conversation to have. I referenced the sanctuary cities. I mean, if you could look at a whole host of policies. When he was in Madison, he voted against photo ID. I think photo ID is an essential component of election integrity. We have different views as it relates to economic policy. When he was in Washington, D.C. as a United States congressman, he voted to cut veterans benefits as a means of balancing the federal budget. I think we have to make sure that we're providing the resources to our veterans that they earned while wearing the United States military uniform. And so there's a host of policy disagreements between my opponent and I, but that's the conversation I think we should be having as a country during the election.
Final question, given the steep national partisan divide, what's one issue that you think has the potential to be resolved in a way that brings parties together?
I would love to see us come together, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives, to address our energy needs here in the United States. We have an opportunity for an all-of-the-above energy approach. That means there will be more wind and solar. I think nuclear should be part of the conversation. There'll be more oil and natural gas as well. That has an opportunity to not only bring down costs, but also to make our country more secure by having a domestic supply of energy. In the coming years, we're going to see a dramatic increase in total energy consumption as new businesses such as the Microsoft's $3 billion investment in Racine County in their data center come online, as well as historical Wisconsin manufacturing companies that are large consumers of energy, as well as hard workers who are filling up their gas tank to get to work or drop their kids off at school. We need to come together as a country, in particular, on an essential policy such as energy policy. There's something for everybody at that table, and I'm going to continue to work to make sure that we do that.
Well, thank you, U.S. Representative Bryan Steil of Janesville, the Republican incumbent candidate for the 1st Congressional District. The election is November 5th. Congressman Steil, thank you for talking with WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me on.
This programming is brought to you by our generous sponsors. Thank you for watching.